Well, good evening to you all. It's so good to be here. I'm loving this room for a conversation like this. This is really fabulous. And thanks again to all our hosts at Samford for making this conversation possible. And I have a few questions to get started with that certainly come out of the discussion this afternoon. There'll be plenty of time for additional questions that emerge. But I'm wondering if we could start actually reflecting a little bit vocationally. I'm mindful of a wonderful group of university students who are here, and I'm just thinking about the ways that vocationally we are each pulled into being here tonight. And I already did start this panel discussion by asking Dr. Pasquarello at our table about the vocational moment that led to the publication of his wonderful book on the beauty of preaching. And I was fascinated to hear that the answer was, 25 years ago, reading and really deeply engaging Augustine's writing on beauty. And 25 years later, we have this conference because there was a book, because of that engagement with Augustine. And who knows what seeds are being planted here at this conference for what will happen 25 years from now in some place and with some combination of people we can't begin to imagine. So I'm wondering if I could ask you each to reflect vocationally, especially about the turn toward engaging public worship in some way. So at what point in your own journey did some turn take toward engaging, more deeply reflecting on public worship practices? And realize that if I ask that question to panelists at one of our worship conferences, some of them might say, when I was in high school. Some of them might go even younger than that. And some might say, it was only when you asked me to this conference that I began to think about public worship. But even that is a vocational turn. And then I'll just say, the healthiest conversations often involve both. People who've spent a lifetime working on it or reflecting deeply on it, and others who bring very fresh insights from work that they've done in other contexts. So I'm wondering if we could each take a few minutes. And would it be okay to go in reverse order from this afternoon? And Debra, for you to start. Yep.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I grew up in evangelical Methodism and went to church every Sunday. Have vivid and pleasant memories of that experience. When I went to college, which is the school where I teach now, West Virginia Wesleyan, which is a United Methodist related school, it was a little more high church than my evangelical roots. I sang in the choir and learned for the first time historic Christian music that I did not know. I knew the evangelical hymns, but I didn't know the St. Matthew Passion or sort of the Western classical tradition. That was new to me. That sort of began a kind of interest in not only worship, but beauty in worship. And then I guess just, chronologically, later divinity school, reading people like Augustine and Aquinas and other thinkers throughout the many eras of church history. Again, just being drawn into how they talked about, wrote about, invited thinking about the worship of the triune God. And lastly, I would just say I never saw a disconnect between any of those three eras of my own life. And the stuff that I've thought about or reflected on or have written about, I think, has tried to see where there's commonality. One thing I remember so vividly about communion in my little Methodist church in rural West Virginia was we were so small that we would all go up to the railing and kneel, and the pastor, who had 3 other services to do because he was on a charge where he had to sort of travel around the town, the country roads, would give us communion. And And it felt like what it feels like when I go to a much more, higher liturgy kind of church, that we're all, beggars in front of God. Whether I'm kneeling as a 6-year-old in a rural Methodist church or in a impressive building with ministers' investments, but it's still that continuity between being hungry for God and hungry for the beauty of God. So.
Thank you.
I grew up in the church, but did not actually become a Christian until I was in college. And I got heavily involved with InterVarsity, which is a parachurch organization. And I remember really distinctly, I was an art major, and graduating, and half of my friends were running off to do parachurch or missions or seminary, and I was going to be an artist, and I didn't even really know what that meant. And so feeling very isolated in the sense of like, the church doesn't have a place for me. What does that mean? What does that look like? I went to secular universities, secular, graduate school. And so for me, the church really became somewhat of a siloed shelter, and it was evangelical church. And so I was used to those kind of traditions and the things that we learned in there, and just assumed that every Christian is like that, right? And it wasn't until I got involved in like 2009, 2010, after I'd already started teaching at a Christian university with a group called SIVA, Christians in the Visual Arts. And SIVA is an ecumenical group of faithful artists across the country, of Methodists and Baptists and Catholics and Greek Orthodox, and started hearing and really seeing, wow, there are different kinds of Christians. This is really cool. And so starting a lot of those kind of conversations, and then I don't think I really started like ingraining it into my work as an academic until I came to Samford in 2014 and got involved with the brand new, at that time, Center for Worship in the Arts. And one thing that I really appreciate about Emily and Eric and Wynn and some of the others who've been here over time is they had a very kind of ecumenical approach to it. And just learning about all of these different kind of liturgical traditions that, for me, through most of my kind of history as a Christian, were new, right? Like I didn't know about those things, and so just over the last decade or so, really learning a lot, really seeing how those practices, those liturgical practices and spiritual, or those kind of daily disciplines can really like help grow deep roots in regards to my faith. And so, that's kind of my journey. And so now I've been really intentional about finding ways to intermingle my artistry with the church and make sure those things overlap and intersect.
Grew up in Baltimore, liberal Episcopalianism, got converted in high school through Young Life, went off to Berklee College of Music to be a recording engineer in Boston. And about my senior year, a handful of us who were Christians started a Christian fellowship at Berklee, which still exists. And we had a local pastor helping us who went to Park Street Church, which is a good church up there. And after helping us for a year, he got transferred somewhere out in Michigan. I don't know, Tony DiOrio. I don't know if you've ever heard of him. Anyway. And so everybody kind of was like, who's going to take over the Bible study? Kevin, you're getting ready to graduate. Maybe you could take over the Bible study. It's like, okay, I don't know what I believe about much of anything. I better go figure it out. So I started going to used bookstores. I found an essay by C.S. Lewis on the reading of old books, where he suggested reading 2 old books for every new book. And I found that was pretty often the case, that those were more helpful. I also discovered that, used bookstores are kind of graveyards of liberal faddish theologies that come and go. So I read a lot of books, and I'd come in one week and teach, really bad stuff. And I'd be like, oh, I read this other book. Sorry, guys, I was wrong. So that's helped me in college ministry, because I really do believe that, that Jesus' sheep hear his voice in spite of everything. Because I would never, advise anybody to do what I did. But God helped. And so then I went off, came down to Nashville, was going to be a recording engineer, did that, was playing in a Christian rock band after that. And like the church wanted somebody to teach a college Sunday school class. And so I was like, well, I kind of did that, that last year at Berkeley. I guess I could help out. And that was kind of drew me into that. And eventually I just felt like I liked playing music. I remember I was at the art house that this guy, Charlie Peacock, had put together, and different people were talking about their art. And I was like, yeah, I play guitar, but I really like talking to students about the gospel over a cup of coffee. Maybe music needed to shift. It was pretty gradual, but it just shifted from a vocation to an avocation. And I really thought I was done with music when I went to seminary. When I got recruited into RUF to do campus ministry, they even asked me how my music background might, work itself out. And honestly, all I wanted was the opportunity to do a seminar on popular culture and why it mattered. Because at that point, we'd had a World and Life View conference, every vocation represented except popular culture. Like that's the one field that God couldn't redeem, you'd never want to be part of. So I was kind of had a little bee in my bonnet about that. But then I started working with these students. Like I said, in the mid-90s, I just was so frustrated with a lot of the songs that we're singing, and I found I had some old hymn books that had songs that seemed more helpful, but they didn't have any music in them. They're just texts. And so sometimes I'd be like, hey guys, let's try and sing this one. We can sing it to Come Thou Fount tune this week, but I Xeroxed off the words. If somebody wants to write a tune, then we can try it. And we did that for about 5 years. So really for me, and also we weren't doing worship, right, as far liturgical worship. We had this Sunday school class that was kind of our little counterculture community. We had the RUF meeting. We don't do the sacraments in RUF. That's part of the PCA kind of tradition. And so I basically had the opening prayer, call to worship, and the songs, and a sermon. So more of a sense of the songs need to count, and just getting more and more into that. And then we eventually made a record. We got that grant from Calvin. That opened me up to a whole world. Like, because I met all these people. I met Jimmy Abington, I met Emily Brink, I met Lester Ruth, all these people that were part of the Calvin Grant Board that were, these kind of major figures in all these different denominations, and started learning just so much about that, and then eventually got asked to teach hymnology. So I still really don't lead worship very much. I would say I help provide songs and resources, and I get to teach hymnology every other spring. But I really am a pastor, first and foremost. I'll lead at a conference out now and then, but not regularly.
So there's so many directions the conversation could take, but the conversation I'd like to suggest next is actually going to be to think about the conference theme and to think about the Bible. Okay, so my question to you all is, how many Bible texts did you hear references to today at some point already? Okay, and this is suggestion to students who may be here, that one really good way to go to a conference is to start a little scripture index. Okay, so like, what Bible text did we engage at this conference? And hint, there are a couple of amazing sermon texts that you can already put in your index. What I really would love is one of the worship apprentices from Calvin, if you have your phone out, to just create a little list, and then you could text it to me, and then we'll work on the index, and I'm helping to write the talk that'll end the conference tomorrow, okay? So we're working on our Bible index, okay? So my question to everyone out here is, what text did you hear in the presentations today? So think back and just call them out. Psalm 111 and 112. Nice. Oh, good. I'm so glad. Good. Okay. And Colossians 3, okay. Colossians 1. Zechariah 3. That's a memorable one. Put that in your little sticky note in your Bible by that text. You'll never forget it, actually, after this afternoon, right? So 1 Samuel, okay. Acts 17. Philippians 4:8. Psalm 63. You're doing well. This is amazing. Yes, the Galatians reference. Okay. Now, what I'd like to do actually is to turn it back now to the three of you to reflect a little, either on a text you want to make sure makes the index by the end of the conference, or a text that did come up today that you'd like to come back to. Okay? Actually occurs to me a category. We didn't name a specific imprecatory psalm, but I think that category at least ought to be in there. So I'll give you a chance to just think a little bit about it by mentioning one. I would love for us to have a little time as we go along here to get to know Bezalel and Aholiab. Exodus, it's 24, I believe, yeah? The Spirit of the Lord that equipped the artisans who helped equip and make the tabernacle. And it's an amazing text that talks about the Spirit of the Lord equipping the craft of shaping that space according to God's command. And one of the amazing things it says in that text is that the Spirit inspired them not only to do the craft, but also to teach the people. And that would be one of the texts even behind that refrain that I helped get started this afternoon. I'm preparing worship for the people and the people for worship. It was the Spirit to do the craft, but also to teach. So I just want to say, let's put the Exodus 24 marker on our conference index of Bible texts. What other ones would you add to the list? Any of you?
Revelation 21:24.
Okay.
The kings of the earth bringing their glory into the heavenly city, and then in the next chapter, there's no impure thing in the city.
Okay.
So we're putting those two together.
So that end of Revelation, which is an echo of Isaiah 60.
60.
Yeah. 60. So that's good.
I mentioned Psalm 96 at the end of my talk. Specifically for me, the imagery of nature and the created world, the seas roaring, the joy of the forest.
That's great. I'm reminded Psalm 96 and Psalm 97 and Psalm 98 all have creation praising. And in the early church, those were the Christmas Psalms, because there was a reference to the coming of the Lord and all creation singing praise. So actually, mark that down. Deborah, what would you add to the list?
I think I would add Genesis 1, and this is actually a bit to prefigure my breakout session in the morning. In the Septuagint, in the Greek version of the Hebrew text of Genesis, you know the refrain of that liturgical poem, and God said, and God saw, and in most English translations it says, and God saw that it was good. But in the Greek, it's God saw that it was kalos, which is beautiful.
Beautiful.
And God saw that it was beautiful. And I think it kind of turns the tables on who's doing the viewing of the beautiful. And it's from the perspective of the divine. So
that's powerful. That's powerful. Wonderful. Well, as we go through, let's keep working on adding the list. And it wouldn't take that long for you after the conference to buy little sticky tabs. Take your Bible out and put a sticky tab in all the texts that we engaged at this event. It's one of the best, literally, souvenirs from a conference event if you learn to see connections in the Bible text. And I think we will have done a good job if we're inviting you to read those texts with fresh eyes. And I love this work in part because of learning from colleagues. I will have, and I have a Bible with me on the plane ride home, I'll be doing this, thinking about these texts in new ways. So it's wonderful. So now while we're at it, let's also do a old books index. All right? Except I want to expand this a little bit because we really want to be open to old books, older artistic works. Okay, Joe, that's for you too. I'm trying to make sure we're inclusive here of the visual, or architectural works, or song texts. Okay, so things from the great history of the church that have informed our discussion. So what examples come to mind in the index of historical examples from today's event so far? Anyone? Something you heard or a reference along the way? Oh, yes. Yeah, John Calvin made his appearance, yeah. Okay. Augustine. Okay, so let's even go more specific on Augustine. Oh, Jeremy Beggy, who's absolutely current theologian who's done a lot of work on theology, worship, and the arts. Books that kind of appeared late 90s, I think, were the earliest, probably. Yeah, that's really good. With Augustine, it's Augustine's Confessions, I think. But just say, Michael, the text that you were especially inspired by.
Book 10:27. Say, have I loved thee, beauty ever ancient, ever new.
Powerful. And a sermon on what we know as Psalm 45.
40 on R45 and
Yeah.
44.
Yeah.
The beauty of Christ, which he traces from his birth all the way through his death and resurrection.
That's right.
Except for the way he says he's beautiful.
Right. And that's a new one to me. So I'm going to go home and I'm going to be looking for that one. That's powerful.
Favorite little section of the Confessions is where he talks about how moved he was by the sweet singing of the church, and the songs into my ears and the truth streamed into my heart. So I think a lot of time, one of my drum beats is how God has used more than just preaching. And particularly in my tradition, my tribe, you would just think that the whole history of the church was about good preachers. Yeah. And how many of our preaching heroes actually spent significant effort curating the church's song.
Yeah. I know for me, Salvador Dali would be on the list. Deborah, could you say a bit more about that choice? And it was so compelling to have that on the screen. And anything more you'd like to just take us into your selection of that image? And it's powerful.
Yeah, and I will mention it's just a detail. So if you do look up the entire piece, it's pretty striking. And if you know much about Dali's work, and I'm no expert, I would defer. There's a very modern surrealist cast to what the eyes of the head of Jesus on the cross looking down, what he is looking into and over. So that's interesting. I like the detail of it in part because it suggests to me utter humility, and I think humility is a facet of beauty, of divine beauty and human beauty. Yeah.
Powerful. Joe, anything from the history of the church that you want to add, perhaps in your teaching of whether it's imagery or anything else that?
Yeah, I would mention an artist we haven't mentioned today, but Caravaggio. He's a Baroque painter. He was a scoundrel, a murderer and a scoundrel, and God really used him to make really powerful work to point back to the stories of the Bible.
Absolutely.
I want to make a plea for reading the hymns of Anne Steele. And a friend of mine actually it's on Amazon. You can buy like her poems. It's called Refuge of My Weary Soul. Anne Steele, I wrote a little preface for it. So if you can't find it, you can look up my name. It's TWIT. There's not many of us. I think those are really great.
That's powerful. We are so shaped by those who've gone before. And I think about discussions like this and how enriched these are by historical references. And especially if we think about the Augustine references, part of the power of Augustine, for me, is reading Augustine again about every other year. I wish it could be every year, but even every other year is okay. And it just, as life proceeds, it goes deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. And things that I found a little mystifying, like 10 years ago, after about the fourth time, they become electrifying even. And so I love in a conference like this just hearing what are the sources. Let me just back it up one step further and ask the three of you, if I could, what other sources would you name? This might be mentors, might be books, experiences, but you think, wow, that part of my own formation really is what is working through the kinds of things that I'm sharing today. So, Joe, do you want to go first?
Yeah, one of the things that jumps out is Pilgrim's Progress, that book, and in the way that, again, he's using an analogy and metaphor to create these pictures of the spiritual life. It was really powerful for me in my formative years, and I've had the chance recently now to read it with my kids. And that's been really fun to watch them kind of come alive and like all of a sudden it's like, oh, they get it, And so it's an old book, but it's a really powerful one.
I think my experience of coming to love poetry one of the things that happened when I first came back to West Virginia to teach where I teach is I had a colleague who lived in the same town. It was about a 30-minute drive to campus, and he's a poet, a published poet and a beautiful poet. And so on the days that he would drive, I would read him theology, which he was appreciative of. And on the days that I would drive, he would read me poetry. And it literally was an education for me. And I credit it with being a kind of turning point in my own scholarship, in my own teaching, in part because poetry, a poem, a beautiful poem, crystallizes language and experience and opens up endless possibilities of interpretation. And I think we need more of that kind of aesthetic when it comes to reading scripture. Because I feel like sometimes our approach to scripture is too much, what's the nugget of truth I need to dig out of this, and when I get it, I've got it, I don't have to go back to it, I'm done. And I think actually scripture, and much of scripture is poetry, like the beginning of the Bible. And so that's been profound for me, to have a poetic sensibility to text, to worship, to writing theology. It's been crucial.
It's hard to narrow down, so many old hymn books have been really helpful. I did mention, though, with regard to popular culture, there's a book that a bunch of Calvin professors did, Dancing in the Dark. You can find it cheap in used bookstores. It was a multidisciplinary study, people from all these different kind of departments, and it's fabulous. It answers some of the questions about even how do you think about criteria, fit and form, all this kind of stuff's good. And that Ted Turnow article that you can get from the 2002 Calvin Theological Journal on reflecting on popular culture, those are both really helpful. If I had to pick one hymn book, I'd say Spurgeon's Our Own Hymn Book. It's 1,000 texts, and there's a new version that Matt Boswell and Chris Fenner, who's the archivist at Southern Seminary, put out a new version of it, critical edition. It's really helpful, just even to read devotionally.
How many old hymn books do you own, Kevin?
A lot.
Yeah,
I don't know, 1,000 maybe. Yeah, because I keep looking for ones that are more obscure.
Yeah.
Like,
how do you remember? I don't own this one. Like, how would you even remember?
Library
if you own 1,000?
Library Thing. I have them all cataloged. Oh yeah.
What a guy.
Fortunately, I never thought I'd go to seminary.
Yeah.
So I thought I would just have to learn on my own and
Yeah.
be a traveling musician. And then when I went to seminary, I had to leave half my books at my parents' house.
Yeah.
And so I had to catalog them. So fortunately, I've been doing that ever since.
Wow. See, there are some people that get in Ecclesiastes toward the end there when it says, of the making of books, there is no end. And there are some people who read that as a curse. But some of us read that as a blessing. Like, that is good news. All right? Because there's more to explore and more to learn. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Great. I would love to ask a question, and Deborah, I really would love to reflect a bit on Trinitarian theology. So the truth is that I had a chance to read your book, Teaching That Transforms, is the title. It was published first in
2006.
Yeah. So I had a chance to read that when it came out. And this is the first chance we've had to meet. I'm actually so excited I got to meet an author of a book that I loved. But part of what's so compelling about that is the Trinitarian vision that it conveys. And so my question really is, I'm going to ask it broadly of all of us to reflect on, what other dimensions of Christian reflection do we find just utterly compelling? But I do want to ask a specific question about the Trinity, because the doctrine of the Trinity can be the hardest doctrine to take a theology exam about. But then sometimes what that does is it puts an arm's length between us and that powerful doctrine. Could you say a little bit about how that came to be in your writing, and it came through so beautifully this afternoon, so compelling? Was it an author engagement with a text, a particular way of formulating it, or just kind of take us into the compelling nature of God's triunity that comes through in your work?
I think one way to get at that a response to that is, you know, when you go to seminary and you learn Trinitarian theology, and we talked about our mutual fan club of Jeffrey Wainwright, you realize, or I realized, I never heard much Trinitarian theology in the church. As much as I loved my little church and as much as the churches I was a part of, it seemed like, in my context, it was something that was kind of trotted out on Trinity Sunday. There's a Trinity Sunday in the Christian year for those traditions that follow a lectionary. And so Trinity Sunday, you would sort of trot out the analogies and is it like a clover? Is it like the 3 states of water? You know, and children's sermons, God bless those who give them, would try to somehow communicate this mystery at the heart of God. So part of it was just, why don't we talk about it, teach it, preach it better, try to embody it better? And then, of course, again, just reading people like Augustine and Aquinas, and even more modern folks like John Zizioulas in the Orthodox tradition and Catherine Lacuna, who really make, in different ways, the point that Trinitarian theology is not doctrine to be believed in, but something to be embodied and participated in and practiced. So that was the impetus, you know, how do we, because that book actually came out of the experience of working as a director of Christian formation in a church, and I felt like, well, I've been asked to write this book about how to do Christian formation in a church, so I better go do some. And so I did some at that church, and then just trying to help that congregation as a staff member, not a pastor, but on the staff. What are the ways we can embody Trinitarian life? Which means many, many things, but one thing it means that we are all connected. That if God is a sociality of being, we are a sociality of being as the body of Christ. And so, yeah, just, I guess, rooted in the fact that huge disconnect between the church's historic teaching and the beauty of its vision and lived practice.
That's powerful. That's powerful. Other themes that you each have found particularly compelling that, you know, kind of keep you coming back and draw you in more deeply?
Well, I think the importance of liturgy. So I told you I grew up liberal Episcopalian, so did the Book of Common Prayer just to see if I could get through it without looking at the book, right? And then go into a season of no liturgy, right? A more free church tradition, even though it was a Presbyterian church. And then particularly coming to like Calvin's short treatise on the Lord's Supper, beginning to understand how vital that was. You talked about moving from, word and table together. Even like, I remember being at Calvin one time at the worship symposium, hearing the Nairobi statement and being like, I've never heard this stuff. We just talk about preaching and singing songs. And so I think some of those things have been really helpful, and just rubbing shoulders. I remember there was one time you had a thing at Calvin where all these people that taught worship gathered. You did that thing where you asked what text, and it was like 60 people, and they all had a different text. Yep. I'll never forget that, because I think I was like, man, it's everywhere, and there's so many ways to approach this, and just that just has helped me on the journey of there's so many people to learn from, especially outside of my tradition.
This makes me think my wife Sarah is a preschool teacher at the preschool at our church, and she teaches 4-year-olds, and she was teaching them a couple weeks ago about the Trinity. And she says to this, the little boy, that Jesus was the Son of God. And he's like, but Mrs. Cory, wait, Jesus was also God and the Holy Spirit. Boy, he was a lot of people. Not
a good start.
Yeah, right. So I think for me though, this idea of community is so important. And we're made as humans to be in community with one another, and that's one of the things that I think we all missed so much during the pandemic, and not being able to worship together in an embodied form of community. So anyway, that's something that I just continue to come back to. It's what's kept me in the church, is that I know that there's a community, the fellow believers who are there, and they care for me, and they want to see me grow as I want to see them grow. So whenever we start, it's like the flock, right? Whenever we start to stray, they bring us right back. And so anyway, that story made me think of that.
It's good. Good. One of the joys for me of an event like this is really these questions are occasions for us to really give our testimony, right? There's a testimonial dimension to this. And if I think back over the years, many times the invitation into a new topic came because I had a chance to hear someone give a testimony. But usually the testimony wasn't a formal testimony in a worship service. It was an informal testimony in a hallway conversation or at a Starbucks. It was someone who would sit down and say, I'm so excited about, and then what would come next? It might be a book, might be a song, might be an album, might be an old book, right? Might be any of these things. But that testimonial way of speaking matters. And one of the things that actually, we should do an index of testimonial moments in this conference. We ought to do that, actually. Because once we get started with that now, and then you could just list everything you've just heard here from our panelists tonight, and then by tomorrow afternoon, just see what we can add to the list. And see what we hear from each other about moments that have compelled us and inspired us and drawn us in. I would like to ask next really a question about topics that we would love to pursue further. So on a day like today, 4 of us came. We didn't coordinate what we were going to say ahead of time. So now we have these 4 presentations kind of all juxtaposed. We have your comments and questions. And so what's wonderful is the generativity. And it means that there are some topics and themes that it would be ideal to explore more deeply. So I'd love to give the 3 of you a chance to identify one of those, and then I'd love to open it up to the group for topics and questions that you'd like to explore as our conversation continues tomorrow. So I'll start with one, give you a few minutes to think here, and it's to say, I felt compelled to share that, yes, beauty needs to include things that we think of as more sublime and also those things that are sacrificial, and I'm very convinced about it. But the question is, how does that work out in our lives still? And I think there's some unexplored territory to pursue a bit more there. And I'll just say, for me, one of the big challenges comes around imagery for the cross. And that Salvador Dali image was so arresting today for me. But there are some depictions of the cross that do also trouble me, that are a little too sentimental, or some that seem gory to the point of shocking. And so I feel an unanswered question in my own soul about the range of how imagery for the cross reveals and conceals the beauty of Christ. So it feels to me like we need a little more work on that. And it's certainly something I won't have all the answers for in the next day. It's a question of ongoing reflection. What other questions or topics would you put on the list of to be continued or to be probed further?
I feel like I have too many things I already want to study. But one that's moving more to the top of the list is the imprecatory Psalms, not just to explain away, but to embrace and to utilize. And that's not just from your comments, but a conference I was at last weekend and a new book coming out and a really fascinating talk about that and how important it is and also because I know one of the great lacks in traditional hymnody is social justice. There's almost none of it, even from people who are very involved in it personally, except if they're versions of Psalms. And that's really fascinating and interesting and tragic. Yeah.
Thank you. That's good.
The project that I'm working on now, really gonna be beginning hopefully next year with a sabbatical, hopefully, is a project on climate grief. And the way I would sort of connect it with these concerns is if God saw that it was beautiful, what are we doing? What have we done? And why can't we talk about this in church? And of course, it's a contentious issue. Of course, there's division about what we mean by climate change. Personally, I find climate change too innocuous a phrase. It's not changing, it's in catastrophe mode. And I'm also concerned when that reality gets sort of couched in terms of this is what humans have done to the earth. Humans have done this to the earth, but not all humans. And the vast majority of the world's humans are suffering in ways that the powerful interests and people of relative privilege and safety are not. And we have something to say about suffering. And so that's the constellation of themes I'm going to be working on: beauty, suffering, this gorgeous world, and the grief we feel as it's dying.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm interested in and that I kind of alluded to today, and I'll touch on in my workshop tomorrow, is how artists and church leaders can work together. And I think so often there's tension created because they speak very different languages. And this reminds me of my friend David Taylor, who's a theologian, and he told this story a few years ago that he was in Italy sitting at a table in a cafe, and the waiter came up and he was like, "My cousin, Amy Grant." And David's like, "What?" And he's like, "My cousin, America, Amy Grant." And David's like, "Your cousin's Amy Grant?" And the guy's like, "Amy Grant." And then he figured out that he was actually saying immigrant. Oh. But it was like two completely different conversations happening because of the language barrier. And I think so often between theologians and between artists, especially visual artists especially, there's this barrier, and that just what happens often is it results, and I've seen this in my work with other artists and through SIVAs, there's this just frustration on both sides because it's like they're speaking past each other. And there's gotta be a way, and I know I'm not the only one who's thought about this and said we need to do more research on that, but there's got to be a way where we can figure out some kind of way to bridge that so that there's not as much tension, but B, there's more harmony in regards to the work that's being done in the church, in the visual arts, but then also with theology as well.
Okay, what other topics would you add to the list? Anyone? The nice thing is we don't have to resolve all these tonight, okay? But what other things would you add? So, question to pursue further, topic to add to the agenda. Go ahead.
I'm just throwing it out there. I've been asking this question to myself with all these like theology classes I'm taking. It's like, how far do we go to try and understand God's work with our own understanding and not the entire divine intervention of God? So what is too far? When is it too far of our own understanding?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
We don't even understand what God is meaning to do.
Okay. That's a powerful one, right? And I'm just saying, right, on the one hand, the gift we receive of Scripture and the Spirit's inspiration, and then right next to, but we see through a glass darkly, right? So to hit that mix of intellectual humility and yet living out of the intellectual giftings that we've received just right, that's huge. Absolutely. So thank you. Anyone else want to put a topic or a line of questioning out of today? Lament. Say a little bit more. Is there a particular aspect about that you find intriguing or that you'd like to probe?
I think maybe the evangelical Protestant church as a whole
Yeah.
I think in the past maybe 5 years, we started to see a
Yeah.
little more, I guess, interest. But on the whole, I think there's a lot to learn there. And I should have said biblical lament.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Powerful. Thank you. So that biblical lament, absolutely something that feels to me is continuing to attract more work. And I especially appreciate that idea of grieving, what that means for creation itself. And then partly this conference saying we need to grieve not just when there's not truth, but we also need to grieve the lack of beauty and perception of beauty is part of what there is to lament too. So thank you. Others. Yeah, Paul.
So practicing in a local community to cultivate a sense of beauty in worship takes a great deal of intentionality, of
Yeah.
seriousness of practice and honing of craft and skill. But we also deal with many of us don't have a lot of resources.
Yeah.
Or the time, or the capacity to take things to perhaps the level of beauty that that we would want to achieve. Beauty seems to me also something that's always just beyond
Huh.
us. Like we're searching for the beauty of God, which we can never quite attain. But so there's that pole. But then the other pole is this sense of contentment, gratitude, rest, receiving of God's gifts, and there's a tension there that
That's
I think
good.
on a practical week in, week out doing ministry is difficult to navigate, to negotiate. I don't know if anybody else feels this tension at all, but
That's good. Thank you.
You touched on a word that several of us have been talking about in between. A few of us are writers, and we're kind of like the stepchild of the arts here. So we would like practical ways to use writing, but not just writing, but architecture. I know Samford does a great job with their architecture program. I think
Yeah.
they said at one point they put Jesus into every wall that they design. Videography is a huge tool now in churches. How do we make that beautiful and not hokey? There are lots of different forms, different genres
Yeah.
of art
Yeah.
that can come from nature. I know churches are putting in prayer paths, walking paths. So just to see a broader practical aspect of how to go home and plug that in.
That's good. So writing, videography, architecture, dance. Yeah, or really any use of posture and gesture, whether it's taken all the way to dance or not, right?
Or if you go to a church that's frozen shows and how to stand in prayer.
There you go. That's right. And when it comes to language, poetry, the use of language in preaching, the use of language in prayer, actually writing about these practices. So can there be beautiful and evocative writing on the Facebook post 3 days ahead of the Sunday service? How could that be done in a way that is attuned? So good. Okay, so there we go. We have to extend the conference by another day. Yep. Cancel the flights back home. We're going to stay for an extra day, but we will see. Thank you for that. It's very good. Okay. We're going to be wrapping up in just a moment here. Any final thought that the three of you would like to share here today? Reflections on day one, and kind of initial encounter before we wrap up our conversation.
Just grateful for your attentiveness, always.
Yeah, I think I would just say, especially for those of you who work in the church, there are artists in your church. Use them. You don't have to bring in outsiders. They're there and they want to be used. They just, they don't know necessarily their place, and so look for them and give them opportunities.
I just marvel always, at what I might call the jazz of God. how these things that we all prepared individually, I mean, with a theme, but wasn't one of these conferences where they spelled out, here's exactly what you do. It was like, what do you want to add to this? And then to see how that all kind of builds on each other when that wasn't our intention. I just always think that's awesome. Yeah.
Wonderful, and I believe tomorrow morning is really a time for that jazz, and for you to all enter that jazz too, because right ahead of, I believe, the opportunity to engage informally with several other presenters will be in the mix. And I would just say, don't underestimate the opportunity or the influence that you have through the questions to actually affect the second day of an event like this. I'll be thinking about these pretty much all night long. Hopefully not too much in the middle of the night, but it is wonderful to be in an event like this and to be drawn in more deeply.